Hey guys, Ponce here, and today I thought I'd talk to you about what I consider makes an overpowered champion and which champions this sort of stuff applies to. Now, I realize overpowered is a bit of a loaded term, so I mean, you can really word it how you want, like champions that Ponce thinks are really good, or whatever. But I think it's just kind of splitting hairs. And the other thing to keep in mind is I'm talking about solo queue here, not the super crazy, top tier competitive scene. That's like a bit of a different thing because they do different things up there compared to us mere mortals. But you're going to notice a lot of overlap actually when you compare it to like let's say the most common picks at in the LCS, the World Finals or something, which are currently going on because well, good champions are just good champions. I mean, you can't change the fact that something deals a lot of damage. It doesn't matter who's playing it. But in any case, what I feel makes a good champion, you can break it down into roughly three areas. And basically, you'll notice that every champion that I mention is proficient in these three areas that I'm about to talk to you about. It's going to seem very kind of basic and simple at first, but you'll notice some interesting things about it. So, first, obviously, every champion, to be considered overpowered, in my opinion, needs damage. Sounds very basic, but let's break it down further into burst, AoE potential, percent damage, and range. So that's just point number one. Point number two is tankiness. And when I mean tankiness, there's raw stat tankiness. So HP, magic resistance, and armor. And there's also tankiness, or more so, I guess, survivability. I roll the two together in sort of a single stat in my mind. So survivability slash tankiness through mobility, CC, and utility. Now that last point, mobility, CC, and utility, is my third point again because it's also useful in an offensive sense. So not only oftentimes do these things make you defensive, but if they also have an offensive application as well, I consider them sort of a third category. So let's just sort of move into sort of the two main types of champions with like basically everything that I consider extremely good. First off, I'm going to go through. You'll notice they're basically all mages or assassin-y mages, or outright assassins. But what I like to call them is raw burst plus survivability through utility, mobility, and killing people before they kill you. So you have basically such burst that the burst itself becomes your survivability. Sort of what I probably consider the well, maybe not the poster child because there's several equivalents, but Ari is exceptionally good. Ari is basically the champion that I think is probably, if not the best, one of the best champions that is not consistently banned. Like she's a really, really good champion. And the reason for that is, just look at her kit. She has extreme burst plus AOE, um, and then her ult pretty much does everything. It gives you mobility plus burst, so all in one. It's both defense. That can be used defensively and defensively. You're in trouble, you ult out. You want to kill that person, ult in. And of course, she has really good poke, and that's sort of a laning phase slash team fights that get drawn out, and there's lots of poke sort of thing. And her charm is another form of CC, which can be both used offensively and defensively. So just an exceptional kit all around. Like there are really no drawbacks aside from the fact that obviously she's a mage, therefore she doesn't have like the raw stat survivability. But you overcome that with basically positioning skill and just sort of general mobility. Zed is very similar in that regards. Zed is an exceptionally good champion in my opinion. Um, he has really good burst potential. I mean, you guys all know that. He has some AoE. His AoE isn't the greatest, but he has some. He's got pretty good poke. He's got some CC. Again, not the greatest, but like these shortcomings are pretty much nullified by the fact that he has exceptional mobility through his clones. Like he's just all over the place. He's really hard to pin down, and he's just got crazy burst potential. The one thing that holds him back is he's got a really high skill cap compared to most champions in League of Legends. Like, no champion in League of Legends is really hard. Like, if you really want to, you can get good with anyone just by spamming them over and over again. But Zed is definitely one of the more difficult ones. Next, let's move on to Fizz. Still, we're under the same sort of this type raw burst plus survivability through mobility archetype. Now, Fizz, Again, he's got extreme burst potential. You noticing a pattern here? Extreme burst potential plus AoE. Pretty much everything he does is AoE. Not everything, but pretty much everything is AoE. Playful Strike slash Trickster plus Urchin Strike means extreme mobility. Again, both offensively and defensively. You're in trouble, just Playful Trickster, dodge a skill, and then Urchin Strike out. Or, I want to kill this guy. I'm going to Urchin Strike onto him, then Playful Trickster onto him. Uh, Now, Fizz, his only one drawback is limited poke. So, I mean, that's kind of putting him near the line of things that, may or may not be overpowered, or just basically things that are really, really solid and always good on solo queue. The poke is a little bit of a problem, but he's so good at everything else, like, I kind of feel it cancels that out of it. Like, if Fizz had poke, yes, he'd be just borderline broken. Or not borderline, he'd just, like, be flat out broken. So yeah, there's that. Next we have Oriana. She's the last of these sort of mage types that I consider extremely powerful. So Oriana has burst potential, again, burst potential, plus AoE, plus poke. So she has all the damage requirements to make her really good. Uh, she has CC and sort of utility through her, again, her ult and the dissonance command thing, slows people down and speeds her up. So again, both sort of an offensive and defensive possibility there. And survivability, yeah, a bit of survivability through command protect thing. So she gives up a bit in terms of damage compared to, like, Ari and Zed and Fizz and stuff, but yeah, she has command protect. So I think that makes up for it. And she makes her a bit of a different champion. But the way I like to think of Oriana is she's basically a better Morgana, really. I mean, their kits are kind of similar-ish. Morgana is, obviously a bit more kind of utility, an AP mid that's bordering on a support sort of thing. But yeah, Oriana's just basically a better Morgana. That's how I'm going to put it. So and then the next category of, oh, by the way, before I move on to the next category, I'm not going to be talking about AD carries at all. AD carries are their own sort of thing, and they're pretty much never really overpowered, at least not right now, in my opinion, anyway. I mean, certain champions had extremely good kits compared to other champions. For example, Draven was kind of borderline overpowered with his damage, and Ezreal was really crazy before they nerfed him. But, AD carries are always going to run into this, like, they're basically all just damage, and the difference lies in just quite, how much damage they do and how good they are at kiting compared to one another. So I don't really want to split hairs with AD carries. Like, AD carries is just AD carries, in my opinion. I don't play the role, so I don't want to talk about them too much. That's what it boils down to, I suppose. But in any case, next category I'm moving on to is tanky plus mobility plus damage. So basically your bruiser sort of archetype. So basically what I want to go over is sort of the bruiser type characters. That basically have it all, and make it much easier to play and sort of decide where you're specializing in terms of your stats. We're going to start off with Jarvan because I main Jarvan. If you guys haven't watched my previous videos, basically I main Jarvan top lane, which is somewhat unusual. But as I explain, kind of why I think Jarvan is sort of in the overpowered class, at least for solo queue. You'll probably see why. But basically, Jarvan is tanky, right? No one's going to argue with that. Jarvan deals decent damage, which I can see some people arguing with, because the context most people are used to Jarvan coming from is sort of like the tanky, supportish sort of jungler. Jarvan actually can resemble an assassin if you spec him that way. For example, I put everything into, I put 21 points into offensive masteries, masteries. I take offensive runes, and I build him very offensively in terms of my item setup. And basically, because of his gap closer, he starts to resemble an assassin. So, you EQ onto a person, ignite them, hit them with your passive, and then you ult them, and then they kind of die. Plus, the other thing is Jarvan has exceptional poke for a top laner. A lot of top laners kind of suffer from the fact that, they can't poke people out, and, they're sort of weak to that kind of thing. Jarvan is really good if you get good with his lance skill shot thing, so that's really good poke. It does quite good damage. His flag, to an extent, deals some poke damage. It's usually best not used that way, but you can do it. Jarvan has very good CC. His flag EQ combo thing is a knock-up. His shield is a snare. And his ult, it's not, hard CC per se, but it gets people stuck in that ring, so that can be considered CC of sorts. He's got some utility for his team, his shield giving, the armor buff to everyone. Oh no, the attack shield buff to anyone. Sorry, they nerfed and took off the armor thing. Um, and of course, Jarvan has exceptional mobility. It seems to catch actually a lot of people off guard. You EQ combo onto just kind of into the lane or something, and then ult onto them. That covers an extremely massive area. You just kind of suddenly cover. So those are basically the reasons I feel Jarvan is an exceptional case of sort of the tanky bruiser type. He's basically got everything. He's got CC, he's got damage, he's got mobility, and you don't really need to spec too hard one way or the other. Like, get his damage okay, you do need to spec into damage, which is a bit of a concession, and it obviously cuts into his tankiness, but he's still pretty tanky, even if you build him fairly offensively. Next champion I'm going to move into is Lee Sin. Lee Sin is tanky. He's pretty tanky. And you can afford to build him pretty tanky because he can deal percent damage. And even if you build a little bit of damage on him, his damage is always going to be okay. It's not the greatest in the world. But what really, really comes into play is Lee Sin's extreme mobility. Like, his mobility is like one of the best in the game. Plus, you can say he's got some CC. He's got, a snare through that, whatever it's called, the ground shockwave, ground pound thing. It slows people down. He can also kick people into, things. So that's a displacement. It's a form of CC. So as you can see, he's got a lot. The only thing he's kind of weak at is his poke is not the greatest in the world. He's more about the all-in. But, usually he's played in the jungle anyway. So it's less of an issue. Renika is the next champion I'm going to move on to. Renika is widely considered a very solid top laner, and well, the reason for that is he's tanky, both through sort of stats and sustain, because he's got Kuldamik that heals him. Also, his ult gives him HP. He deals decent damage overall, especially early on. He can deal a lot of surprising damage. It falls off a bit later on, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Renika has exceptional mobility through slice and dice. It's not the greatest in the world because you have to actually hit something to get the second part off. But if you can get the second part off, especially if you use minions to your advantage and stuff, or you, slice into someone trying to gank you in lane and then you dice away, it's a very good way of using it. The only problem with Renika is sort of lack of poke. So that's more of, again, a laning phase sort of thing. And his damage somewhat falls off later on, even if you spec him or build him very offensively. Damage never becomes terrible, but it's not quite as good as some other bruisers who can deal damage, that making it sort of hard to, super hard carry if everyone else is losing. But, it's sort of a minor issue, just because his laning phase is exceptionally good. Next, this is one of those borderline champions. I kind of included him. I'm not sure if I should have, but Hecarim is really, really good in solo queue. Partially because of his crazy ganks. But, Hecarim always has okay damage. You can build him almost exclusively tank with maybe an offensive item or two in there. And his damage is going to be okay. He's got pretty good just sort of inherent tankiness, especially with his, whatever that thing is called, his W, that gains some 20% of damage dealt back as health to him. He's got decent CC. He's got the devastating charge plus his ult. Again, his ult is just pretty crazy. And they've nerfed it like twice, and it's still good. And he's also got extreme mobility. But then again, he's not exceptional in in any area here. He's just kind of okay at everything, which is why he's a borderline example. But, it's something to consider. He's definitely not a bad jungler. I would... he's really good. Let's just put it that way. Lastly, we're going to move on to two more champions that are a bit different from everything I've mentioned thus far because they're sort of an AP percent damage thing. But we're going to start with Elise. Basically, Elise has percent damage. Yes, she has two forms of it, which allows, and this is the thing about tanky, or rather percent damage. Percent damage basically allows you to focus mostly on just getting tankiness. Because percent damage is always just percent damage. It's good no matter what. I mean, you can spec into it, but typically the gains or the returns are somewhat limited. And all you really usually need is like cooldown reduction or armor or magic penetration, and then just percent damage is good. So of course, like I was saying, Elise can focus on mostly being tanky and just rely on her percent damage. And on top of that, Elise has CC. through that spider web skill shot thing. And of course, Lisa also has exceptional mobility. She moves faster while in spider form, and she has that, a thing where she goes up in the air and drops down on people, whatever the hell it's called. I'm not very good at skill names, if you've noticed. But yeah, it's mainly the percent damage thing. I can't stress this enough, but if you notice a champion has percent damage, usually that's something you can exploit very heavily. Because as the next champion you'll see with Zac also has percent damage, and on top of it being percent damage, he deals percent damage AoE. And so, of course, this allows you to spec almost exclusively into tankiness, which makes him extremely tanky. He's got decent CC, and he's got exceptional mobility. The distance that his elastic slingshot covers at 5 ranks is absolutely incredible. It's not as big, obviously, but it kind of actually resembles almost rank 1 of Nocturne's Paranoia. Obviously, it's different, so don't comment on that too much, but or think about that too much. But that's just he's got a lot of mobility. Zac basically has everything for a tanky type champion. The only problem is it's kind of hard to super hard carry with Zac in solo queue. Like if everyone is losing, if you're a high burst, super damage champion, then yes, you can carry. But with Zac, if everyone on your team sucks except for you and you're super fed, you can hang around and it'll take people a really long time to kill you, but generally you won't be able to kill everyone on your own. Or they'll just ignore you and kill your team, sort of thing. But Zac is just so good that he overcomes that to a large extent, I feel. And another thing I want to talk about is let's go a little bit into sort of percent damage and basically the ability to focus all your item purchases into a single area. The best example I can think of this is old Mordekaiser. I'm going to guess most of you guys watching this video have never seen old Mordekaiser, but basically he was just a lot better at everything, except for the fact that he had crappier AP ratios. Also, another big issue was items way back in the day are quite different. Randuin's Omen gave, what was it, about 15% cooldown reduction. Yeah, 15% cooldown reduction, and Spirit Visage for a while changed, and the new Spirit Visage is actually kind of like the old Spirit Visage. So basically all you had to do on old Mordekaiser was build, because his shields were better, you gained more shield and it lasted longer. So what you did is you gained you spec just into tankiness through items like Randuin's Omen and Spirit Visage, which also gave you cooldown reduction, and then you got some magic pen through masteries and runes, and then maybe an item or two in there. And so you became exceptionally tanky because you just always had your shield and you were always spamming out your cone, basically all your abilities. And you would ult someone, and eventually, like the AD carry or something would die, and no one would ever be able to kill you. It was actually quite amusing. But yeah, that's just sort of a case of you have a champion who your itemization results in both damage and tankiness. If you can manage that, like you're basically optimizing your character by killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Every instance you can find of that in any champion, you need to exploit things like that. I didn't really think of a modern example of that. I probably could if I wanted to spend some time on it, but I wanted to use old Mordekaiser as probably the best example of that, of item purchase efficiency, essentially. So next what I'm going to talk about is champions that I think are really good and consistent. So definitely, I'm not saying if you use these champions they're crap. In fact, the only reason I'm mentioning them is because they're very, very good. But they tend to lack in just this one area that can sort of hold them back. But of course, you can still definitely do really well with them. You can spam this champion. If you're good to this champion, nothing wrong with them. Continue playing by all means. I'm just going to kind of highlight the fact that the previous champions I mentioned are usually kind of good in all circumstances. These guys can fall short in very specific circumstances. So, for example, let's start off with Darius. Darius has very good innate damage, really good burst, and can get pretty tanky. And you can focus actually largely on tankiness and then still do okay damage through his ult and stuff like that. Just the problem is he sort of falls short on utility, even though he has that, that pull ability. But other than that, he's got that melee range snare. But overall, what this leads to is sort of a lack of mobility and making him really easy to kite. So he sort of falls short in that regards. But and he's like a his power curve is quite interesting. Like he can scale decently in the late game, but basically his early game is so powerful that by comparison, when his late game sort of falls off a bit, while it's not bad, it's definitely not as good as his late game. So he is a bit of a problem in that regards. Kassadin is a champion I was almost kind of debating putting in that same class with Ari and them, because basically he has everything. He's got burst, he's got CC, he's got extreme mobility. Just the problem is his early game just really sucks, so he can get shut down. And that's the main thing. Like, I'm not a Kassadin expert, but yeah, the main drawback definitely seems to be the fact that his early game is just kind of hard to deal with, and he sort of scales somewhat slowly depending on how you want to spec him. Like he gets really good if you build tier and tier, which leads into the staff, and then eventually Rod of Ages kind of thing. But always a very slow build, and it takes a while to get going. Malphite is actually a champion I don't like too much, but I kind of listed him here anyway because he's super tanky. He's got tons of CC and utility. He's got okay mobility because of his ult, and the fact that he has CC and like snares and stuff allows him to catch up to people. So that I kind of consider that mobility in a sense, but his damage sucks. I mean, I realize exactly as you hit 6, he's got sudden pretty good burst, but overall he just doesn't have damage. So it's very hard to hard carry. He can do a lot for his team, but sometimes you got to do everything yourself. Kennen is another example. He's got good damage, tons of CC, and damage on top of just being good damage. He's got his burst is somewhat lacking, but he's got good ranged poke, especially for a top laner if you stick him up there. And he's got really good AoE. He's got good mobility. Did I mention tons of CC? I must have, because he's got tons of CC. Yeah, so good mobility. The only problem is he's not very tanky, and he's sort of an all-in champion. So, to get the most out of him, you got to get in close. And if you get in close, the fact that you're not tanky can really screw you over. Now, of course, you can cover for that to an extent with Zonya's Hourglass, but, it's not, oftentimes it's not good enough. Rumble is kind of similar in that regards too. He's similar-ish to Kennen. I don't want to talk about Rumble too much on his own. But after that, we have Nasus. Nasus is tanky, can focus, and therefore can sort of focus on just the tanky, or not therefore, but he can focus basically just on the tank stat because of Siphoning Strike, right? You know how Siphoning Strike works, of course. It's, you hit something and you slowly farm it up because more and more damage, and it doesn't really go off of any stat. It gets better. And he has Sustain innately, and his ult also makes him tanky. He's got okay CC, Wither's pretty good. The problem is he's not exceptionally mobile. He's really easy to shut down early lane. And the pace at which he gets better is very slow and limited. It's limited by the Siphoning Strike farming. So if you're sitting there farming Siphon Strike forever, maybe the rest of your team just dies in the meantime. So if his Siphoning Strike was good from the beginning, then Nasus would be crazy overpowered. But it's not. It's a slow burn sort of thing. And also again, his mobility holds him back a little bit. But that's why Nasus isn't good in all situations. Another slightly situational champion, or rather the two champions who are very good, but again a bit situational, are Nidalee and Jace, because they're very good, but they're all in kind of, at their most basic level, two teams are crashing into each other. It happens 90% of the time because people don't like to think in League of Legends very much. Sort of all out, drag them out, knock them out fights. Both of these champions kind of suck at them, unless you do tank AD carry or AD Nidalee, which is a weird build. But I wanted to talk about that. Standard sort of poke Jace builds are really bad at that. So what you end up needing is teams that understand poke comps, or at least strategies, and split pushing. And of course, most people just don't get that, and they don't have the patience for it. So it ends up kind of screwing you over if your team just doesn't understand it. It's the sort of thing where I'm sure that you guys have experienced things where it's like, hey, guys, I'm going to go split push, do not engage. And the instant you move away from your team, some guy on your team just suddenly tower dives or something. It just happens all the time, which leads to you losing, and therefore, not very consistent. Like I said before, consistency is the important thing here. Singed is another example. He has basically everything minus the burst in his damage. Like it's decent damage over a long period of time. People actually underestimate how much damage he can deal. The problem is his laning phase can get pretty sketchy. Like certain champions just completely shut him down. I think the worst laning phase in existence is probably like Swain versus Singed. That is horrible. Go try that with your friends if you want to, but it's not a fun experience for the Singed. Um, and he's also susceptible to repeated ganking because sometimes his escape can be a bit lacking. And also late game, you can sometimes especially if the rest of your team is losing, you can run into the problem where people can basically sort of ignore Singed and just kind of bypass them. Usually, it's very hard for people to ignore Singed. That's why the whole "don't chase the Singed" exists. But if you do ignore Singed, basically you can murder his entire team if they're not very strong in the meantime. The other thing is Singed is also a split pushing thing. So again, the whole split pushing thing I was talking about with innately and Jace, that's an issue as well. Instant you leave, someone on your team decides to tower dive. Swain is another champion I like to put in here because he's extremely durable for a mage. That's why you can even see him top lane sometimes. And he's got really good CC. Again, another sort of typical top lane thing. But his burst potential is kind of crappy, and I don't know what it is really because I don't really play him. But not too much anyway. But his damage doesn't actually seem that good. It seems to actually fall off quite a bit unless you're really fed. Swain is almost sort of a feast or famine champion. Um, because, when he's a fed, Swain is crazy. He's like nigh unkillable, and he'll just kind of run through your entire team. But if he's not fed, he's just sort of there, and he's okay, and he's got okay CC, so, that's why he's not my favorite. In a sense, he's more kind of a long-term, sustainy version of, I guess, almost Mastery. Mastery is the opposite. If he gets fed, he'll run through your team by killing everyone. But if he's not fed, he just sort of sits there and sort of does damage, but, not the greatest. Vlad is another champion I like to use under this category. Basically, Vlad has everything except for the fact that his early game is pretty crappy. He can get shut down pretty hard. But he's got He's got pretty good damage. He's got AOE. He's got survivability or tankiness through sustain. Plus, usually people end up getting Zonya's hourglass. So someone will pool, then they'll Zonya's hourglass, then they'll sustain back up, and then they'll pool again. And it's just incredibly frustrating late game to deal with, especially if the Vlad is fed. But of course, his drawback is, his crappy early game gets shut down quite easily, and his lack of CC. Also, his mobility isn't that good either. He doesn't really have like a gap closer way to speed himself up or anything like that. Last example I'm going to use is something I'm not too sure. Maybe I shouldn't end on things I'm not too sure on, but I had to mention because I don't play this champion and he's very weird. And I'm not sure why he's not the greatest because it seems like he should be really good. But Mundo, he's kind of weird because he's tanky, he's got okay damage, and he's got the aforementioned percent damage. So it kind of seems like he has everything because he also has, CC through his cleavers. But I'm guessing what the problem most likely is his sort of his okay mobility. He doesn't really have anything that makes him particularly mobile. And also the percent damage is skill shot dependent. And also it's percent damage of current health, which is not as good as percent damage max health. So, I mean, that's probably what's holding him back. But you'll see he has percent damage there. So every time someone has percent damage, this is how my brain works. Is this guy's got percent damage. We got to think what he can do. But every time they have percent damage, it's something that can be used, or you should at least try and use it. But yeah, that's everything I have to say on sort of my take on what makes an overpowered champion in a solo queue context. Again, Yeah, I know there are like in specific areas, there's champions better than the ones I mentioned. The reason I don't mention them is because they're lacking in the other areas. What I was, again, to reiterate, what I'm trying to cover is the fact that really good solo queue champions have damage, um, uh, and also consider when I say damage in regards to burst, AoE potential, percent damage, and range. Um, they need tankiness, both in terms of raw stats and through the mobility CC utility sort of stuff, and the mobility CC utility in terms of an offensive output. So really, it's just kind of, I guess, suppose it's damage and tankiness, and then mobility CC utility kind of adds onto those. But I think it's distinct enough. So that's all I have to say on the matter. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you're wondering why I'm looking over in this direction, I had notes on all this stuff. I can't, do this all off memory, so I wrote it down first. If I can copy paste this into the description, I'll try. I don't actually know if it'll fit. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Goodbye.